I caught my husband cheating. He laughed and said I'd never find someone better. The morning sun poured through the large bedroom windows, casting a golden glow over the perfectly arranged furniture. Everything about the house was meticulously curated: expensive vases, designer furniture, and photographs that painted the image of a perfect marriage. A woman stood in the kitchen, carefully brewing coffee, a habit she had developed over the years to accommodate her husband's preference for strong espresso. As she poured the dark liquid into a cup, she felt a sense of contentment, believing her life was everything she had ever wanted. She had built a comfortable home, supported her husband through his career, and settled into a routine she thought was secure. They had met in college, when she was still young and full of dreams, and he had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and ambitious promises. Their life together was supposed to be one of mutual love and respect, a partnership that would withstand the trials of time. Yet, a nagging feeling had been creeping into her heart for months now, an unsettling whisper in the back of her mind. Her husband had become more distant, his once warm affection replaced by hurried goodbyes and distracted conversations. He worked late more often than before, leaving her to eat dinner alone at their expensive dining table. When she asked about his schedule, he dismissed her concerns with a casual laugh, saying she was imagining things. Even on weekends, when they used to take long walks in the park or watch movies together, he now found excuses to be elsewhere. It wasn't just his absence that troubled her, it was the way he looked at her, or rather, the way he no longer did. Once, his eyes would light up when she entered a room, but now, he barely seemed to notice her presence. She tried to shake off her concerns, blaming them on stress or paranoia. Maybe he was just busy, focused on his work. After all, he had always been ambitious, always striving for more. But as she picked up his dress shirt from the laundry pile, a faint but unfamiliar scent lingered in the fabric. It was floral, sweet, and distinctly not hers. A lump formed in her throat, but she pushed it down. She wouldn't jump to conclusions, not yet. She would wait, observe, and hope that she was wrong. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine, but the doubt had already taken root in her heart. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while her husband slept soundly beside her, she felt an unfamiliar sense of unease settle over her. The life she had built, the love she had trusted, now seemed fragile, like a glass ornament balancing on the edge of a shelf. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. The first time she truly began to question everything was on a quiet Thursday evening. She had planned a surprise dinner, his favorite meal, a bottle of expensive wine, soft music playing in the background. She had taken extra care with her appearance, wearing the dress he once said he loved, the one that made her eyes stand out. But when she called him, expecting him to be on his way home, his response was indifferent. "I'll be late," he had said, the noise of clinking glasses and muffled laughter in the background. "Don't wait up." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stood there for a moment, phone still pressed to her ear, as the warmth of anticipation drained from her body, leaving only cold emptiness behind. The next few weeks followed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Late nights turned into weekends away. Meetings that once ended at 7 now stretched until midnight. When he was home, his phone was glued to his hand, screen tilted away from her view. Texts that used to be filled with affection had become curt and formal. Even the way he spoke to her had changed, his voice held an edge of impatience, as if merely answering her questions was a burden. She started to feel invisible in her own home, a ghost of the woman she once was. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head, that she was being overly sensitive. But the truth loomed in the shadows, waiting for her to acknowledge it. One night, she decided to confront him, choosing her words carefully so as not to sound accusatory. "You've been distant lately," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Is everything okay?" He barely looked up from his phone. "Work's just been crazy," he muttered. "Don't make a big deal out of it." She swallowed hard, nodding even though his answer felt hollow. The weight in her chest grew heavier, but she wasn't ready to face the truth just yet. She still held on to hope, even as the evidence against him continued to pile up. She wasn't looking for proof when she found it. She had never been the kind of person to check her husband's phone or follow him around. Trust was supposed to be the foundation of their marriage, and she had always believed in him. But that night, as she folded laundry in their bedroom, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He was in the shower, and without thinking, she glanced at the screen. A single message flashed before disappearing into the notification history. "I can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." The air in the room suddenly felt too thick, her heart pounding in her ears. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, unlocking it with the code she had known for years. A string of messages appeared on the screen, each one cutting deeper than the last. Flirty exchanges. Intimate confessions. Plans for secret getaways. Her breath came in shallow gasps as reality crashed down around her. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was real. When he stepped out of the shower, she was still standing there, phone in hand, unable to move. He saw her, saw the screen, and for a moment, a flicker of something crossed his face, shock, maybe, or irritation. But not guilt. Never guilt. He simply exhaled and reached for a towel, as if her entire world hadn't just crumbled before her eyes. "You shouldn't be snooping through my phone," he said, voice annoyingly calm. That was all he had to say. Her hands clenched into fists, her whole body trembling as she forced the words out. "You're cheating on me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, undeniable and irrefutable. He didn't deny it. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if she were a child throwing a tantrum. "You're overreacting," he said, running a hand through his wet hair. "It's not what you think." She felt her stomach twist in fury. "Not what I think?" Her voice cracked. "I read the messages. I saw everything." She expected him to apologize, to at least try to explain himself. But instead, he smirked. "So what?" he said, crossing his arms. "Do you really think you can do better than me?" The words struck her like a slap. The arrogance in his tone, the complete lack of remorse, it left her breathless. For years, she had built her life around this man. She had given him everything, her time, her energy, her love. And now, he stood before her, laughing at her pain. A cold realization settled in her chest. This wasn't just betrayal. This was cruelty. And the worst part? He didn't believe she could leave. He thought she would stay, like she always had, no matter how badly he treated her. She didn't cry. Not in front of him. Not in that moment. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out, heart pounding with adrenaline. She needed air. She needed to get away from the suffocating presence of a man who had just ripped her heart apart. But when she stepped outside, she realized the nightmare wasn't confined to their home. News of his affair had already begun to spread. Friends looked at her with pity. Acquaintances whispered behind her back. Some even had the audacity to ask what she had done wrong, as if his infidelity was somehow her fault. The humiliation was unbearable. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of judgmental eyes on her. The woman he had been seeing was younger, glamorous, the kind of person people admired. Meanwhile, she was now just the discarded wife, the woman who hadn't been good enough. And worst of all, he didn't care. He paraded his new lover around as if their marriage had never existed. She felt like a ghost, wandering through the ruins of a life she no longer recognized. But deep inside, beneath the pain, something new began to take root. A quiet, burning rage. The legal process began faster than she had anticipated, yet every moment felt like an endless nightmare. Sitting across from him in the lawyer's office, she barely recognized the man she had spent years loving. He spoke with a smug indifference, treating the dissolution of their marriage as nothing more than a business transaction. He had already moved on, making it clear that he had no intention of fighting for anything other than his own convenience. "I'll be fair," he said, though his definition of fairness was anything but. He had drained their joint bank account, leaving her scrambling to figure out how she would survive. He had a high-powered attorney who crafted every clause to benefit him, ensuring she walked away with as little as possible. She fought back, refusing to be stripped of everything she had worked for, but the battle exhausted her. The process dragged on, each court date another opportunity for him to remind her how little she meant to him. He never once looked remorseful. If anything, he seemed entertained, as though watching her struggle validated his superiority. She was forced to give up their house, the one she had decorated with care, the place where she had imagined building a future. In the end, she was left with barely enough to start over. He had made sure of that. As she signed the final papers, he smirked and leaned in slightly. "Good luck finding someone better," he whispered. His words were meant to break her, but in that moment, something inside her hardened. The first night alone in her new, much smaller apartment felt like falling into an abyss. The walls were bare, the furniture was secondhand, and the silence was deafening. She had spent years creating a home filled with warmth, only to end up in a cold, unfamiliar space that smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. The worst part wasn't the material loss, it was the emptiness. For the first time in years, she had no role to play, no wife to be, no household to maintain. Just herself, raw and broken. Nights were the hardest. Sleep evaded her, and when it did come, it brought dreams of him laughing, of their past life slipping through her fingers. Every morning, she woke with an aching hollowness, a cruel reminder that she had to start from scratch. Her friends tried to help, but their words of encouragement felt distant, like echoes in a void she couldn't escape. Some had already moved on from her story, treating her divorce as old news, while others pitied her too much for her liking. Finding work was another struggle. She had spent most of her marriage supporting his ambitions, leaving her career in the background. Now, job interviews were a reminder of what she had given up. Employers saw her resume and questioned the gap, their skeptical eyes making her feel smaller with each rejection. Bills piled up, stress mounted, and she began to wonder if he had been right. Maybe she really wouldn't find anything better. Maybe she had already lived the best years of her life, and this was all that was left. The phone call came on a day when she had nearly given up hope. An old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, reached out unexpectedly. "I heard about everything," the voice said, full of warmth and familiarity. "And I think I might have an opportunity for you." At first, she hesitated, embarrassed by how far she had fallen. But desperation overpowered her pride. They met at a small cafe, where she found comfort in the presence of someone who didn't look at her with pity. The offer was modest, an entry-level position at a company that had nothing to do with her past life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. And for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten: possibility. The first few weeks were difficult. The work was fast-paced, demanding, and unfamiliar. She had to learn everything from the ground up, battling the fear that she wasn't capable enough. The job required resilience, something she wasn't sure she had left. Yet, each day she pushed forward, forcing herself to focus on the small victories. She became good at blending into the background, absorbing everything around her. Slowly, she found herself gaining confidence, her mind no longer consumed by thoughts of the past. There were still bad days, moments of doubt, nights when she cried over what had been lost, but they no longer defined her. The cracks in her heart remained, but they no longer bled as deeply. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had lost until she started reclaiming the smallest pieces. It began with simple things, changing her routine, rediscovering old hobbies she had abandoned during her marriage. She started reading again, something she once loved but had neglected in favor of keeping up with his interests. She took long walks in the city, breathing in the life around her, letting herself exist in spaces she had once ignored. For years, her life had revolved around someone else's expectations. Now, for the first time in a long time, she was learning to live for herself. It was strange, uncomfortable even, but there was a quiet thrill in it too. Her job, though still challenging, started to feel less like survival and more like an opportunity. She worked late not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She found herself enjoying the sense of purpose it gave her. One evening, her boss called her into the office, surprising her with unexpected praise. "I see potential in you," he said, handing her an assignment usually reserved for senior employees. The words lingered in her mind long after she left the office. It had been a long time since anyone had believed in her. It had been even longer since she believed in herself. That night, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and realized something: she was no longer the woman her husband had left behind. She was becoming someone new. Not everyone was happy to see her rise again. Some former acquaintances, the ones who had thrived on gossiping about her downfall, seemed almost irritated by her progress. There were whispers at social gatherings, side glances from those who had once been part of her world. "She's trying too hard," she overheard one say at a mutual friend's event. "She won't last in that job." The words stung, but she didn't let them break her. If anything, they fueled her resolve. She had already lost everything once. She refused to let their judgment define her future. But the hardest part wasn't the whispers. It was the realization that some people would always see her as the woman who had been abandoned. No matter how much she rebuilt, there would always be those who believed she was lesser because of what she had endured. Society had a way of treating divorced women as damaged, as though their worth had been tied to the men who left them. She refused to accept that narrative. She had spent too long letting someone else dictate her value. That chapter of her life was over. She wouldn't let anyone, not even the ghosts of her past, write her story for her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. As the months passed, she began to recognize a resilience in herself that she hadn't known existed. Every morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer weighed down by the grief of her past. The job that once seemed daunting now felt like a challenge she could master, and with each task she completed, her confidence grew. She no longer second-guessed herself when speaking up in meetings, and she noticed the way her colleagues began to respect her opinions. It was strange, almost foreign, to feel valued in a way that wasn't tied to being someone's wife. For years, she had measured her worth through her husband's gaze, but now, she was learning to see herself through her own eyes. Outside of work, she pushed herself to embrace independence in ways she never had before. She learned how to fix things around her apartment, handle her finances without hesitation, and make decisions without seeking approval. The version of herself who had once been afraid of stepping into the unknown was gone, replaced by a woman who refused to shrink under the weight of anyone else's expectations. There were still moments of doubt, of course, memories that resurfaced when she least expected them, whispers of self-doubt that tried to pull her back. But she had learned that strength wasn't about being fearless. It was about moving forward despite the fear, despite the pain, despite the voices that told her she wasn't enough. One afternoon, her boss called her into his office with an opportunity she hadn't seen coming. "We need someone to represent the company at an industry conference next month," he said, handing her a folder filled with details. "You've proven yourself here, and I think you'd be a great fit for this." The words caught her off guard. Her? A representative for the company? It had been less than a year since she had started, and yet here she was, being recognized for her hard work. The idea thrilled and terrified her in equal measure, but she didn't let hesitation win. She nodded, accepting the challenge. The weeks leading up to the event were filled with preparation, long nights spent refining her presentation and ensuring she was ready. She knew this wasn't just about her career, it was about proving to herself that she was capable of standing on her own. The woman who had once been humiliated, discarded, told she was nothing without her husband, was about to stand in a room full of professionals and command their attention. The thought sent a shiver of excitement down her spine. When the day of the conference arrived, she walked onto the stage, took a deep breath, and spoke with the confidence of a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. After her presentation, as she gathered her materials, a woman approached her, a polished, self-assured executive with an air of authority. "You handled that beautifully," she said, offering a firm handshake. "I'm Julia Carter. I run a consulting firm, and I'd love to talk about a potential opportunity." The conversation that followed felt surreal. Julia had been impressed by her ability to command attention, her clarity of thought, and her poise under pressure. "Women like us," Julia said, her gaze sharp but kind, "we don't always get second chances. But when we do, we make sure no one ever doubts us again." That evening, as she sat in her hotel room reflecting on the meeting, she realized how far she had come. A year ago, she had been a woman drowning in heartbreak, convinced her life was over. Now, she was being considered for an opportunity that could change everything. But it wasn't just the job offer that mattered, it was what Julia represented. She was proof that women could rise again, that they could carve out success even after being discarded. She wasn't just rebuilding her life anymore, she was preparing to soar. Though her future looked brighter than it had in years, she learned to appreciate the smaller victories along the way. There was a quiet satisfaction in paying her bills without worry, in treating herself to dinner at a restaurant without feeling the sting of guilt. She redecorated her apartment, turning it from a temporary refuge into a home that reflected who she was becoming. For the first time since the divorce, she laughed without hesitation, found joy in simple moments, and allowed herself to dream again. She no longer carried the weight of needing to prove herself to anyone but herself. Her confidence began spilling into every aspect of her life. At work, she took on bigger projects, leading with authority she hadn't known she possessed. In her personal life, she reconnected with old friends, surrounding herself with people who uplifted her. The version of herself that had once cowered under humiliation was unrecognizable now. She still had wounds, scars that reminded her of the past, but they no longer dictated her future. She was moving forward, step by step, and that was enough. Not everyone celebrated her transformation. There were those who had thrived on her downfall, people who had whispered about her behind her back, waiting for her to crumble. And when they saw her thriving, standing tall, they didn't know how to react. Old friends who had once pitted her now watched with thinly veiled resentment. "She's changed," someone murmured at a dinner party, as if it were a bad thing. She had changed, she had fought for every ounce of strength she now carried, and she refused to apologize for it. She learned to let go of those who couldn't accept the woman she had become. She no longer sought validation from people who only wanted her at her weakest. Instead, she surrounded herself with those who celebrated her strength, who encouraged her to keep rising. It was a painful realization, knowing that some people had only stayed in her life when she was at her lowest. But she was done shrinking herself to make others comfortable. She had spent too long being small. Now, she was finally taking up space, and she had no intention of stopping. Her career soared faster than she had imagined. Julia Carter, true to her word, introduced her to industry leaders, helping her step into circles she had once believed were out of reach. With each successful project, she felt her confidence solidify, her voice growing steadier in rooms filled with powerful individuals. The woman who had once been belittled by her husband was now negotiating deals, leading teams, and making decisions that shaped the direction of her company. It was an unfamiliar but exhilarating feeling, realizing that she no longer needed anyone's approval to thrive. Despite her success, doubt occasionally crept in, whispering old insecurities in her ear. Could she sustain this? Was she truly capable, or was she merely lucky? But each challenge she faced, each obstacle she overcame, silenced those lingering fears. She had built this life with her own hands, risen from the ashes of betrayal, and carved a place for herself in a world that had once dismissed her. And for the first time, she was starting to believe in herself just as fiercely as she once believed in others. As she gained professional success, people began asking the inevitable question, "Have you started dating again?" Friends encouraged her to put herself out there, to find someone who would appreciate the woman she had become. But the truth was, she wasn't ready. Love had once been the foundation of her life, the lens through which she defined herself. Now, she was learning to be whole on her own. The idea of sharing herself with someone again felt daunting, as if it might undo all the progress she had made. It wasn't that she had closed herself off to the idea forever, but she refused to rush into anything simply to fill a void. She was content with her independence, with the strength she had cultivated through pain and resilience. She wanted any future relationship to be a choice, not a need. For now, she was happy focusing on herself, on her career, her happiness, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had rebuilt her life without relying on anyone else. Just when she thought she had put the past behind her, life tested her resolve. At work, a project she had spent months developing was suddenly at risk. An unforeseen issue threatened to derail everything, and for the first time in a long time, fear gripped her. The old her, the one who had doubted her abilities, who had believed she wasn't strong enough, would have crumbled. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Instead of panicking, she strategized. Instead of retreating, she confronted the challenge head-on, determined to prove that she had earned her place. The situation forced her to dig deep, to trust in herself despite the mounting pressure. Late nights turned into early mornings, but she refused to let her hard work go to waste. When she finally solved the crisis, earning the admiration of her colleagues, she felt something shift inside her. She had faced adversity before, humiliation, loss, betrayal, and survived. This was no different. The storm had come, but she had stood firm. She realized then that she would never again allow fear to dictate her life. The success of her project propelled her even further, opening doors she hadn't even considered before. A promotion was offered, one that would solidify her position as a leader in her field. The woman who had once been discarded, told she was nothing, was now a force to be reckoned with. Yet, as she celebrated this victory, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led her here. The struggle, the pain, it had all shaped her into the person she had become. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. But the moment of triumph also brought another realization: she had nothing left to prove. For so long, she had worked tirelessly to silence the echoes of her ex-husband's cruelty, to ensure that no one could ever look down on her again. But she no longer needed external validation. She knew her worth now, and that was enough. Success wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming herself. And in that moment, she let go of the last remnants of bitterness, embracing the freedom that came with knowing she had won, not against him, but for herself. She woke up one morning and realized she felt content. It wasn't a fleeting moment of happiness or a temporary high from another achievement. It was a deep, steady peace, a feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. She no longer woke up dreading the day ahead or questioning her purpose. Her life, once shattered beyond recognition, was now something she cherished. The scars remained, but they no longer defined her. As she sat by her window, sipping coffee in the quiet of the morning, she thought back to the woman she had been on the night she discovered his betrayal. That version of her had felt so small, so helpless. She wished she could reach back in time and tell herself what she now knew, that there was life beyond heartbreak, that she was stronger than she ever imagined, and that someday, she would look back on it all and smile. Because she had made it. And for the first time in years, she felt truly free. She had long stopped thinking about him, or at least, that's what she told herself. But life had a strange way of bringing the past back when she least expected it. It happened at a high-profile charity event, one she had been invited to as a guest of honor. The night was filled with champagne glasses clinking, conversations flowing, and the subtle hum of success surrounding her. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of a woman who had rebuilt herself. And then, she saw him. Standing near the bar, looking almost exactly as she remembered him, except this time, there was no spark in his eyes, no arrogance in his stance. He hadn't noticed her yet, but she could see the difference in him. His suit, once always pristine and expensive, now seemed slightly worn, and the effortless charm he used to exude appeared forced. The woman at his side, the same one he had betrayed her for, was speaking animatedly, but his expression was vacant, as if the world around him no longer excited him the way it once did. Her heart didn't race. There was no anger, no sorrow. Only a quiet realization that he was just another man now, no longer the towering figure that had once shattered her world. He was simply irrelevant. It didn't take long for him to notice her. The moment their eyes met, his entire demeanor shifted. His casual stance stiffened, and for a fleeting second, she saw something she had never seen in him before: uncertainty. He excused himself from the woman at his side and walked toward her with a confidence that no longer suited him. "It's been a while," he said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something off about him, something weary, almost defeated. She responded with polite indifference, as if speaking to a stranger. He asked about her life, and she answered honestly, watching as the realization dawned on him. She was thriving, and he knew it. When he spoke about himself, the illusion of his perfect life crumbled. The woman he had left her for was not who he thought she was. Their relationship was strained, his career had taken a downturn, and financial troubles loomed. The man who once laughed at her pain now stood before her, visibly uncomfortable, forced to witness the success of the woman he once deemed replaceable. He tried to mask his emotions, but she could see it, the regret, the disbelief. He had truly believed she would never find someone better, never recover, never rise above the humiliation he had inflicted. But here she was, standing taller than ever, a living contradiction to his cruel words. "You look different," he finally admitted, his voice lacking the usual arrogance. "You seem happy." He almost sounded confused, as if he couldn't understand how she had built a life without him at the center of it. For a brief moment, she felt sorry for him, not because she wanted him back, but because he was still trapped in the same shallow existence that had once defined him. He had placed all his value in fleeting pleasures, in status, in appearances. And now, standing before her, he was seeing firsthand what true growth looked like. "I am happy," she said simply, and that was all she needed to say. The weight of the past no longer clung to her. She owed him nothing, not an explanation, not forgiveness, not even anger. Just indifference. The next day, an unexpected message appeared on her phone. "It was really nice seeing you last night. Maybe we could catch up properly sometime?" She stared at the screen, unimpressed. It was predictable, his sudden interest now that he saw her in a new light. In his mind, he had always been the prize, the one she had lost. But now, faced with the undeniable truth that she had outgrown him, he was grasping at the remnants of a connection that no longer existed. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had spent enough time looking back, reliving pain that no longer held power over her. He was nothing more than a lesson now, a chapter she had closed long ago. Deleting the message, she smiled to herself. There was no need for revenge, no need for long-winded explanations. The greatest closure was knowing that she had moved on while he remained stuck in the wreckage of his own choices. The final test of her growth came when she saw him again, this time at a mutual acquaintances gathering. He approached her once more, but now there was hesitation in his movements. She saw the questions in his eyes, the unspoken what if? And could things have been different? But the beauty of her journey was that those questions no longer mattered. "You were wrong," she told him softly, not out of bitterness, but out of certainty. "I did find better. And it wasn't another man. It was me." For the first time, he had nothing to say. No arrogant retort, no dismissive laughter. Just silence. And that was enough for her. She turned away, leaving him behind, not as an act of triumph, but as an act of freedom. She had spent years believing she needed someone else to define her worth, to validate her existence. But she had built something stronger, something unshakable. She had become the woman he never believed she could be. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory of all. He reached out again, this time in person, as if the weight of their last conversation had been too much to bear. She wasn't surprised, men like him never truly believed they could be replaced. He found her outside the event, away from the crowd, his posture uncertain, his usual charm faltering. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice lacking the confidence it once carried. "But maybe we could," she stopped him with a slight shake of her head, her expression calm. "There's nothing left between us," she said, and for the first time, he seemed to understand. He had expected anger, maybe even tears, but all he found was quiet certainty. "I spent years believing your words, thinking I wasn't enough. But I was always enough. I just didn't know it yet." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The power had shifted, and he knew it. Without another glance, she walked away, feeling lighter than she ever had before. Her story had spread farther than she ever intended, but she welcomed it. The whispers that once pitted her had turned into admiration. People who once avoided her, unsure how to interact with the woman whose husband had left her, now sought her out for advice. At industry gatherings, colleagues congratulated her not just on her career, but on her resilience. "You proved everyone wrong," one acquaintance told her, admiration in their voice. "You didn't just move on, you flourished." She smiled, not because she needed validation, but because it was proof of how far she had come. There had been a time when she feared becoming nothing more than the woman he had left behind. But now, she was known for her own merits, for her strength and achievements, not for the pain she once endured. She had built a name for herself independent of him, and that was a victory far greater than any revenge she could have imagined. Fate had a way of offering closure when it was least expected. She ran into him one last time, in a setting far removed from their past. There was no bitterness left between them, only the undeniable fact that they had become strangers. He looked at her with something different in his eyes, not regret, not longing, but a quiet understanding. "You really did find something better," he said, his voice softer than before. "I just didn't realize that better was you on your own." She nodded, acknowledging his words but feeling no need to hold on to them. He was right, but his realization no longer mattered. She had given herself closure long before this moment. "Take care," she said simply, offering a polite smile before walking away for the last time. She didn't need a dramatic ending or a final confrontation. The past no longer had a hold on her, and that, in itself, was the most freeing goodbye of all. She had spent so long proving herself, to him, to the world, even to herself, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without needing to justify her worth. But now, as she sat in her apartment, looking out at the city skyline, she felt a rare sense of peace. She no longer defined herself by the pain she had endured, nor by the success she had achieved in its aftermath. She was simply herself, and that was enough. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the idea of love again, not as something to fill a void, but as something to complement the life she had already built. If love found her again, it would be on her terms, not as a desperate grasp for validation. But for now, she was content in her own company, in the quiet joy of knowing that she had become everything she was once told she couldn't be. Looking back, she no longer felt anger toward the past. If anything, she was grateful. The betrayal that once shattered her had also freed her. It had forced her to grow, to rise, to become the woman she was always meant to be. She had spent so much time fearing that she would never find someone better, but in the end, she had found something far greater, herself. She no longer sought revenge, nor did she wish for his regret. His opinions, his choices, his life, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was her journey, her triumph, her happiness. And as she stepped into the future, she did so with confidence, knowing that she was the author of her own story. She had won, not against him, but for herself. And that was the greatest victory of all.